we have got no piece of legislation when it comes to campaign financing. Different political parties do get their money from different sources, which are actually unknown, because there is no autonomous institution that actually audit these political parties in terms of getting to know where they get the money, first of all, the source of the money, how they utilize that money, and also how much they do inject when it comes to issues of politics. So basically, when it comes to issues of corruption, do get their money from different sources, which are actually unknown, and because there is no by Transparency International, we find that Zambia, of course, is doing not well when it comes to issues of corruption. In 2020, I think we are ranked 33. In 2021, we remained ranked at 23. And there are 181 countries that are actually involved in this index. And of those, we are ranked at 117. So basically that tells you how much we are doing as far as corruption issues are concerned. The situation is not good. It actually worsened with the previous regime. And this can also be seen from the different Financial Intelligence Center reports that we have. For example, in 2018, we lost about 6.1 billion through corruption and money laundering. In 2019, we also lost about 2.2. In 2021, we also lost a huge sum of money when it comes to those issues. And most of these monies, of course, go through either issues of corruption or money laundering through tax haven and so forth and so on. So where the money comes from when it comes to issues of campaign, of course, the issue of big money in politics does play a lot here in Zambia, because we have seen that a number of people that have got resources are actually buy their way through. So most of this money, it comes through illegal expenditure that government, of course, current regimes or regimes that are sitting do engage with those people that we could call big fishes and award them contracts. And when they're awarded contracts, part of that money, of course, is channeled to the to the political parties. And that is the money which is used for campaigns and so forth and so on, and also to even buy voters. It also comes from what we call infamous sources, just like my friend from Tanzania has mentioned. We find that these political parties, of course, get in touch with some of these people that are involved in crime. For example, drug traffickers, terrorists, and so forth and so on. They do fund them, and huge sum of money do come through that. The other source of money is, of course, selling appointments, owner or access of information. Of course, you find that people that are in government, do sell these appointments, for example, to meet the president, to meet ministers, and other funny deals, of course, that brings in huge sums of money that are channeled not only to individuals, but to the political parties, and these monies are actually used for campaign. There is also what we call abuse of state resources, So you find that certain state resources, such as money and also infrastructure that are available to office holders, they use these extensively, for election engineering, So you find, for example, council cars are used for campaigns, People get contracts to do roads. People get contracts and put in provisions where government pays the interest and there is no work that is done. So somebody gets, for example, 4 billion, kwacha, and they have not done any work, but they have gone with that money. And part of that money, of course, is channeled back to the political party. Forcing private sector to pay what we call protection of money. They bring in taxes, that are not understood as far as the private sector is concerned, for them to be able to siphon money. But most importantly, also, the other source is that they actually partner with some of these corporations and companies. Okay, for example, here in Zambia we have got AVIC. When you talk of AVIC, it's one of the corporation that has been working on infrastructure to deal with roads throughout. And you wonder, how does this company every now and get these contracts as if it's the only company that is qualified to do road infrastructure? So part of that money, of course, goes back, or it's refinanced back to finance the then ruling political party. And also we have got business people, of course, who want to be associated and also protect their businesses. They channel a lot of money into these politics. We have got corporations that wants to invest in countries. They come and they kneel down to these ruling political parties and channel in a lot of money. So by so doing, for example, the 2021 election in Zambia, I must make mention to say that it was one of the most expensive elections, because the ruling party by then believed in buying votes by splashing money in the streets and so forth and so on. So you find that if you have got no money, it becomes very difficult for you to be able to survive in such a government. So basically, because of lack of this legislation to do with campaign financing, I think it's affecting the election environment and also democracy in Zambia, because people that have got heft pockets are the ones that can go through. And also it has sent a wrong picture when it comes to the electorates, because the electorates will only wait for somebody who has got a bigger pocket for them to be able to give them a vote. So basically, maybe in a nutshell, let me end here for now. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Chimka. That was quite elaborative. A bit of a similar story back here in Uganda, although I think at some point we shall have to now bring it home on how some of this money is clean, laundered money is cleaned to directly finance elections. But let me straight away get to Zimbabwe. Ernest, can you share your experiences in Zimbabwe concerning money laundering and how that money probably ends up being cleaned in electoral processes?
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all the participants. So thank you very much once again for the opportunity to also share our experiences in Zimbabwe. And I will start by some of the acts and some of the policies and frameworks that are there in Zimbabwe to deal with issues of money laundering. And I will start with the National Task Force, which is an institution mandated to deal with issues of anti-money laundering and also countering of financing of terrorism. And I think this was as a result of, as Zimbabwe, through the Financial Action Task Force, there was a risk assessment of our level of vulnerability with regards to issues of money laundering and terrorism financing. And as a result, there was a recommendation that we really need to come up with a structure which is inclusive in terms of who constitute the National Task Force on anti-money laundering and also issues of countering of terrorism financing. And with regards to the political parties, we have the Political Parties Finance Act, which has been established to try and ensure that the political parties, they mobilize resources from authentic sources, and also to avoid a situation where political parties are being funded through foreign aid, as this may result to issues of money laundering. But maybe just to say, in this particular policy, there is no clear reference to money laundering per se, but some of the provisions in the Act, it speaks to mechanisms to try and avoid a situation where political parties are being used as conduits for money laundering and terrorism financing. And we also have the Bank Use Promotion and Suppression of Money Laundering Act, which is also binding in terms of the sectors. So even the political parties, they are also supposed to be compliant and to adhere to the provisions of this particular policy. So then looking at the money laundering in terms of some of the cases and the experiences in Zimbabwe, I think Zimbabwe is one of the countries that is struggling when it comes to issues of corruption. For example, I can make reference to the Corruption Perception Index results for 2021, probably a trend analysis for the previous 5 years. We have been scoring around 22 out of 100, and also the maximum was 24. And just to note is for 2021, we actually dropped despite some efforts to try and come up with anti-corruption mechanisms in the country. For example, we now have a Zimbabwe National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which has been established to try and solicit support from different sectors around the anti-corruption drive in the country. We also have the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, which is established and mandated to steer the issues of anti-corruption efforts in the country, to resist, ensure that there is reporting of corruption cases. But though there are some gaps that we have been actually engaging, even the officials, the government, for example, issues of whistleblowers, which is also important when it comes to corruption, because you really need to come up with protection mechanisms for whistleblowers who will be reporting corruption cases. And the other issues with regards to illicit financial flows, which is a major challenge at the moment in Zimbabwe, I think, and this is coming in form of misinvoicing, in form of capital flight, in form of smuggling. And if you look closely, especially the issues of smuggling, it really happens mainly in the mining sector, especially for gold miners and also for diamonds. And if you look at who are the active players in this particular industry, you would find that the politicians are the main actors in these particular sectors. So as a result, I'm sure politicians are now involved in this smuggling and issues of money laundering in the mining sector, because of they are actually the dominant group in the within the mining sector of the country. And just like the previous speaker, I think we are also having issues around use of institutional resources during elections. As you may be aware, in Zimbabwe, on the 26th of March, we had our by-elections for about 28 parliamentary seats and over 100 local authority positions. And in 2023, we are also expecting to have our general elections for the presidents and the members of parliament, the councillors, and the local authorities. So just looking at the context right now, it's really tense. And with regards to issues of, in as much as the Political Parties Finance Act, it provides for the national budget to also support political parties financially through the voter appropriation, there is a certain allocation that is going straight towards the registered political parties. But insights from the political players or the politicians, especially those from the opposition, has been really issues of resource constraints despite that provision. And yet, the sitting, the ruling party at the moment, there are also accusations of abusing the state resources, including the public resources that are being collected through the national budget, and also issues of institutional resources, issues of enforcement resources, where they can also make use of for example, the police force and other, enforcement agencies in the country. So these are some of the issues that we are also grappling with as a country in Zimbabwe. And also just to indicate that there is also a worrying concern, especially with regards to civic space. As you may be aware, as civil society, we are the ones who then play a pivotal role of watchdogging and track, try to make research and see what are some of the sources of illegitimate, some of the evidence of illegitimate behavior, and also evaluating the effectiveness of the regulatory frameworks that we have. And right now, there is an ongoing process of amending the Private Voluntary Organization Act, which is the main regulatory framework for civil society operating in Zimbabwe. And this is being done under the guise of complying to the Financial Action Task Force Recommendation 8 for NPOs. So in our assessment, this is also, providing an opportunity for the political parties to continue with their activities and their actions without anyone who is independently evaluating what they are doing without the watchdog or the oversight that is expected of civil society. So it is indeed a worrying concern, and I understand this is not only peculiar to us as Zimbabwe, but it's kind of a continental issue, which even the East and Southern African money laundering group, the ASAMLAG, is grappling with, especially with regards to the efforts being made by countries to comply to the recommendation 8, where the balanced approach, it's all working towards shrinking the civic space and try to infringe even the freedoms of assembly, the freedom of association for other actors. So these are some of the challenges that we are facing right now in Zimbabwe. And now, like you rightfully say, in terms of trying to clean the debt money, it becomes difficult because there is also accusations of a state capture of some of the institutions created and mandated to, deal with the administration of the regulatory frameworks. And yet, if the non-state actors are not operating in an enabling environment, it makes it very difficult. So at the moment, I think the process of trying to clean the debt money is really challenging at the moment. So for now, I think these are some of the insights and experiences that I would want to share with you in as far as Zimbabwe is concerned. Thank you. Sorry, Felix, I see you're on mute. You're speaking, but you're on mute.
My apologies. Thank you so much for giving us a detour of what's happening in Zimbabwe. Our time is fast, running very fast. Let me quickly run to Uganda. Is it a case of the same cloth, different tailors? What is the situation like in Uganda here?
Thank you, Felix, and our dear listeners. I think I should say yes to your question. It seems to be the same across the board. But maybe to rein in from a strategic perspective, money laundering itself as a crime is basically getting dirty money, disguise it, that in your using it, it appears legal, that nobody can know your trace. And thanks to the panelists and to the topic today, that we are talking about money laundering and campaign financing, or politics, money laundering and campaign financing. Who are we talking about here? Politicians. In any nation, the people who have control, who make a final decision on the scarce resources of a nation, are politicians. This alone opens up one thing, that there is a nexus between money laundering and kleptocracy. Those greedy people who want to take positions to make decisions on national resources, as scarce as they are. That actually also leads us to one thing, that how do I make myself be the key decision makers on the scarce resources? And within still this environment, beyond politicians, there are also investors who want to invest. There are multinationals, both internal. So they look at who is popular. How best can we finance him? Because there are formal channels of campaign financing. Those might be known. The government actually must give money to political parties. Political parties are also free and individuals to fundraise internally, externally, but they are supposed to declare the sources of funding. But when we talk about money laundering, you are supposed to disguise the sources of finance, of your finance. So the question here comes in, who is financing the money? What are their interests? And why are they financing? Basically, as we see flag bearers, there are forces behind them who are going to benefit from the minerals, who are going to benefit from the contracts, who are going to benefit from all other government decisions that actually continue giving them money. And this becomes a systemic problem. In Uganda, that's why our experience is simple. For you to campaign to stand for a political position, you must be liquid. Short of that, you're likely not to win an election. And since data money is involved in the process and the decisions on who is to participate in the electoral processes is beyond the legislative framework, but individuals who have financial muscle, then they weed out the would-be people to take the center stage in politics. And because of their deficiencies in finances, they are bought out. Some of them are bought out. And you see data money in play by buying your competitors, by twisting electoral processes to be blind of transparency and monitoring. If at all they are watchdogs, reforms will come in place and they will not be allowed to observe. That's a clear indicator of actually data money into play, that documentation is not supposed to be done. We had, I think, the most troubling election that has just ended, that no camera was allowed at the polling station. But later on, people found their way to actually monitor processes, and we saw money exchanging hands for ticking of the votes. So I think we need to link between data money and its influence in politics. Is it a cloth different? Absolutely, it's the same. The Kenyan politics is not different from Uganda, that he who has the political muscle wins. But we need also to know that where are these data monies coming from? Because since it is disguised, it might be given by a multinational and you might not know the source. But we just see, if at all you looked at, you analyze the trends of the economy within the region, there is inflation always towards the elections. What brings this? There is a lot of money in circulation, and most of this money is data money. How is it actually washed back to your question that some of the people actually acquire this data money as they are still serving, either as government officers or as long-serving politicians? They are connected to deals. So what do? They invest money in shell banks abroad. They invest money in real estate. They invest money, since they are the controllers of power, they are connected to very lofty businesses. So when they sell their property, assuming one sold an apartment, they will declare the source that actually I've sold an apartment to facilitate my political processes. But not all the money will be declared again, because across Africa, there are actually what I would call reasonable laws to control political spending. The problem is who declares, who monitors the injection of the monies, and what amount and what quantity. So this is the problem that actually the region is facing. It's unfortunate that, again, our anti-money laundering regime is not so much watertight, or it's not so much sufficient. That's why we are on the gray list, and we have deficiencies in almost around 9 areas. We've been there with Zimbabwe on the gray list. Zimbabwe left us. We've been there with Botswana. I think it left us. We've been there with Ghana. I think it left us. So being on a gray list alone tells you that you're not biting enough to fight money laundering. But is it a problem that we do not know? No. Money laundering as corruption is a disease we all know. While it might be multifaceted, the solutions are easy, but they become difficult because the people who are key decision makers, who would march and give us the baton and the will to fight money laundering, are at the center of the crime. This complicates it. The Pandora Papers opened us naked. We have a minister in the country who was named by the Pandora Papers. He's a minister. The Panama Papers opened up the Sub-Saharan African corridor, opened up. Several countries and several personalities were mentioned, but again, still some of them are still serving. But we are not losing hope because the processes are there and documentation has been done. Transparency International has a very big archive. These stories are not going to be erased. We saw actually in one of the countries in Africa, which countries this the Diamond Hub, where the president, upon leaving the position of the presidency, the daughter who inherited the wealth has lost every one coin, and that is Angola. So it is a problem, but we can easily solve it. There are already mechanism and the regimes to solve it. We just need actually to support the process. It is not an easy journey because you are dealing with highly politically connected people. You are dealing not only with the drug traffickers, but you are dealing with kleptocrats. When somebody enters in a spirit of greed, we all act like lions. We are ready to tear anyone ahead of us. So this is, I think, what we need to prepare for. But yes, it is a problem across the continent. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Yona, for doing justice to actually tell us that it's more to do with cleaning the money. It's that about you cleaned in the system. And let me come to Kenya. I hope, are you on call? Sheila was driving by the time she was.
Yes,
Sheila.
Yes, Felix. I've been on call. I've been on since we started. Thank you.
Okay, can you share Kenya's experience? We all know how Kenya gets busy during elections, and yes, how big Kenya's economy is as well, but also the influence of money laundering in Kenya's economy and politics. Share the experience.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm not sure that it's my network or yours, Felix, but let's see how that goes, because I think I had you staggering a little. It could be mine, but I hope it's not. But just let me know if you can't hear me, can't get me well. But thank you very much for this conversation. And it's also been great hearing perspectives on money laundering and campaign finance from the other countries represented here on the call by my colleagues. Well, many of you may know, this is quite timely for us in Kenya because we have our general elections in just 4 months on August 9th. We are not in the official campaign period yet. That doesn't start until May, but we have individuals who have been actively campaigning since the last election in 2017, non-stop. So it's been 5 years of non-stop campaigns. And maybe that's why one would say that, it's actually been stated that Kenya's elections are they're actually the most expensive elections in the region and the second most expensive in the world. Of course, administering and management of the elections, from the elections body perspectives and how they manage and the costs entailed in terms of managing the election. But then there's also the other aspect around how much it costs to campaign. In fact, election observation reports and expert analysis over the years have highlighted the need for us to cap spending limits as a measure of lowering the electioneering costs so that a level playing field for effective participation by Kenyans in the elections, either as voters or as candidates, is achieved. We've had a challenge in terms of, we have unmitigated sources of money and uncontrolled spending, which continues to disenfranchise candidates, individuals in the electoral process, particularly those that we would say are politically disenfranchised, women, young people, people with disability, and other people from marginalized groups. Of course, the wide income disparities between the rich and the poor have further conspired to make the opportunity of submitting oneself as a candidate for political office a reserve of, the well-to-do economically, the well-resourced, those who have access to, public resources, and we know what that means in terms of corruption. So even currently for this year, we aren't seeing enough of women, of youth offering themselves for the elections, despite parties actually having been very proactive and coming up to apply affirmative action. For instance, most of the parties are not charging any nomination fees for people with disabilities, and have halved the nomination fee for women. I think some have even reduced by 75% the nomination fee for young people. But still, that is not incentive enough, because you will still have to pay the nomination. Even if you get, you don't have to pay nomination fee, but you will still have to spend quite a bit of money during the campaign process. So it has also created that appetite for corruption for those interested in ascending to leadership and decision making through contesting for political office. The result is that the leadership positions are really become a preserve of the few elite people at the exclusion of a majority of Kenyans. And then, of course, we always say that once you have spent all this money, you've poured so much money in the elections, you'll want to recoup it when you get into office. And so for us, you find that many of our major scandals, you can actually draw a nexus between a scandal and an election. Because many times there'll be a scandal before that comes up, a corruption scandal that emerges before an election, and one that may come after, showing that, there was money somewhere that was stolen and then used to support the campaigns. But generally, let me go to just give you a brief overview in terms of our legal framework in regard to campaign and political financing and anti-money laundering. We have a legislation on political party financing, which was first passed in 2011. And also we have legislation on election campaign financing, enacted in 2013, but sadly, 9 years later, has not been implemented because of vested political interests, that every time we near an election, members of parliament actually defer its implementation to the next election. So in 2013, it was deferred to the next election of 2017. In 2017, its implementation was deferred to this year, to 2022. And then this year, the Parliament refused to throw out regulations that would have helped its operationalization, so that for us to ensure that there's actually regulation and there's transparency and accountability in terms of where campaign money is being fundraised from, who are the sources, how much is being collected or fundraised, and more importantly, how is this money expended? So we don't have those regulations in place because Parliament threw them out on technical grounds. We are just saying that the timelines were not presented on time. So for this year, we are in another situation where we have campaigns, but that money is not regulated. The Constitution, very clearly, our Constitution of Kenya, promulgated in 2010, lays out the foundation for campaign financing in Kenya. It grants the power to our Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission to regulate the amount of money that may be spent by or on behalf of a candidate or a party in respect of any elections. It provides for prohibition of political parties from accepting or using public resources to promote party interests. So there's quite a bit. Our law actually requires a regulation of campaign financing. So in fact, questions around whether our elections are being conducted within an ethical framework as desired by the Constitution, given that we don't have campaign financing regulations in place. In terms of political parties, our Political Parties Act provides for political party funds, which are administered by the registrar. We have the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties. This fund gets money from the Exchequer and other lawful sources that are indicated by the law. There's also a criteria that is used to access the fund by political parties, which is also outlined in the law, and also the law outlines other sources of funds for political parties, lawful sources of funds, like membership fees, voluntary contributions from a lawful source, donations, grants, also from other lawful sources, and it shouldn't be contributions or donations from a non-citizen, a foreign government, or intergovernmental or non-governmental organization. And it also it requires that the proceeds of any it can also come from the proceeds of an investment or project or undertaking in which the political party has an interest. But the law also requires that political parties must disclose all the sources of its funds to the office of the registrar, and they're also supposed to keep records of the sources of the funds, the donations, and so on. They're also required to publish their sources of funding in at least 2 newspapers which have a nationwide circulation, and also submit their accounts. I think it's very important to the Office of the Auditor General within I think 3 months after the end of the financial year, and the OAG is also tasked to, that is the Office of the Auditor General is also tasked to undertake an annual audit of each political party and submit a report to the National Assembly. Then, as I mentioned, we have the Campaign Financing Act, passed in 2013 and acted in 2013, signed into law, but then not really implemented 9 years later. And now it looks like it will be almost another 14 years before it actually sees the light of day, because in this election, it's highly unlikely that we're going to have the regulation of campaign funding as required by required by the Constitution. So maybe the earliest would be 2027, as then the MPs deferred the implementation of that law, though there have been certain efforts by parliamentarians to try and amend the law, but mostly to what I would call adulterate some of the very strong accountability provisions within the law. Like there's one suggesting amendments that may actually altogether remove the requirement that this public disclosure of the sources of funds and how much one is getting for the campaigns from a particular source and how it is spent. But generally, the Electoral and Boundaries Commission is supposed to is mandated with regulating and monitoring campaign funds. And the Act really outlines the sources of campaign funds. It really outlines that the contributions must be can be received from any person, political party, or other lawful source. And the lawful source shouldn't include, for instance, a foreign government. There could also be contributions from a Harambe, what you call crowdfunding or public contribution, but it also sets out limits to contributions. For instance, no contribution from a single source can exceed 20% of the total contributions that have been received by a candidate or a political party, or if it's in the case of a referendum committee. But then maybe just quickly, so I can just wind up. We also have the Process of Crime and Anti-Money Laundering Act, which was passed in 2009. But though it doesn't list political parties as part of the designated 9 financial businesses or professions. And so the political parties have no obligation to report, suspicious transactions within that law. I think maybe my general take-homes, and also just listening to my other co-panelists, what I would summarize as some of the challenges that we have experienced in terms of monitoring the proceeds of crime and stopping the use of dirty money used for political parties and campaigns, is that one, there's really limited information in the public domain with regards to how in terms of political parties spending, because many of them, again, there's a requirement that they have to publish their sources of funding in at least 2 newspapers of nationwide circulation. But then sometimes there's a challenge in terms of getting this information by the public, because sometimes these sources of funding for political parties are not disclosed. You may get what is sent from the exchequer, say for the big political parties that qualify for that funding. But then for the others, in terms of maybe if one has received any contributions, that's a bit difficult to monitor. Then there's also the aspect that a lot of our political parties also, some may receive, and even candidates may receive a significant portion of their funding, especially for campaigns through Harambes, what we call Harambes, but they are public contributions, crowdfunding initiatives. But this mode of funding is problematic because many times, more often than not, the contributors are not documented. And many times they're not disclosed even to the elections commissions, like in the case of campaign funding or the register of political parties for political party fundings. And then, as I said, our election campaign finance act is yet to be implemented, and the continued lack of implementation of the law has seen our campaigns being funded from dubious sources with little accountability regarding the sources, the amounts, the nature of expenditure, and even the spending limits. Previously, our commission has tried to put in place limits in terms of spending based on the geographical location and so on of say the particular electoral area. But this has never really been effected because Parliament, or like this time Parliament actually threw out that notice for the spending on limitations to spending, saying again, of course, saying that these were not submitted on time and so on, so they're thrown out together with the regulations. So even right now, we don't have any caps on spending limits. But then this creates an unequal playing field, especially as I mentioned earlier, for marginalized groups, politically disenfranchised groups like women, youth, and people with disability. I think also what has further compounded our situation is that the process of investigation, prosecution, and hearing and determination of corruption cases takes quite a bit of time, more than 5 years in Kenya. So 5 years perhaps in one court. So if it starts at the corruption case starts at the magistrate's level, most definitely, most cases are often appealed unless someone has gotten off, say, with a light, what I'd call a light fine, that they're then able to pay and move on with their lives. But many times, where say someone has been convicted, you find that they will move on. First, the case will take about 5 years at the magistrate's court. Then they will move to the next. If they are convicted, they will move on to the next court, that's the High Court, and appeal the decision. That's another 5 years. And then if they're still convicted, if the High Court upholds the decision of the magistrate's court, they will again move to the appeals court. So you can go on appealing at least for three other different levels. That's then becomes almost 20 years, for corruption case to be fully concluded. Actually, we have a big problem in terms of the number of pending corruption cases. So what does that mean in terms of campaign financing and use of proceeds of crime? It means that and then when you look at the people who have been taken to court, it's a significant portion of them are what we call politically exposed persons, people with access to power and resources, people who have held high-level positions in government, elected people, and so on. So if additional measures are not particularly put in place to, say, trace, freeze, or recover the proceeds of their crimes, even as the judicial process, the court case is going on, then there's a very high likelihood that such funds will find, their way into political activities such as the campaigns, and then this then has adverse implications and touches on what we're talking about in terms of the money as the proceeds of crime, whether it's money laundering or other forms of crime. And then this becomes then illicit, dirty money that is then pumped into the elections. So they go into the elections and ensure that persons, for instance, that are maybe perhaps even sympathetic to the perpetrators, if they themselves are not the ones standing for elections, that money may be used for people who are sympathetic to them, some of their maybe associates who are seeking office, because you don't need to disclose where this money is coming from or the sources, then you could go ahead to support someone with the proceeds of crime. And that means that once this person is elected, then you have an additional person in your corner who could be able to even influence the outcome of your court case, but there's basically someone in your corner fighting for you. The other thing, negative implication, is that these funds can be used to influence negatively the outcome of the elections, for instance, through voter bribery, voter intimidation, violence. I mean, these are cases that we see in our country during the elections. And we have often argued that if we don't regulate campaign funding, we'll continue to have very many cases of voter bribery, intimidation, intimidation and violence, because if I don't have to report what my campaign funding has been used for, then it's very easy for me to use it for illicit activities. And then finally, these funds can also be used to ensure that, any politically exposed people that have been implicated in corruption are re-elected into the same position, and then with the potential to affect any investigations or prosecution of the cases, and even further, get opportunities to reoffend, to steal more money, and then continue to survive within that illicit system. So I think let me stop there. I had recommendations in terms of how we can move forward, but I would imagine that I will have another opportunity to come back. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Sheila, for painting a picture of what's in Kenya. It's not so different. In fact, Kenya is a very interesting case. Having a law that regulates campaign financing but suspended, in fact, thrown out. Before we proceed, there is an online registration going on, so I would encourage anybody who is following these discussions online to just register on our online registry and be able to pick up your details and also follow up with you. The next round of questions is for short responses, because I allowed this first round for people to really exhaust what happens in their countries. But the next one, let's keep it a bit short so that we manage the time we have. Let me quickly come back to Onesmo from Tanzania, because Onesmo, you've had most of your colleagues, they all share the same. Looks like Africa is the same cloth. It's just the tailors are a bit different, but it's the same cloth. There is a problem. But in view of the problem that we all face, what can our governments do in terms of creating stronger anti-money laundering regimes? Mm-hmm. What can be done?
Yes, maybe I should qualify, because our focus is stronger anti-money regimes during elections. I think we should focus on that, because anti-money laundering regimes is quite broad and in many aspects of life. Of course, during elections, I recommend the following to be done to ensure that we are not going to get dirty money or during elections, or to launder dirty money during election. First of all, let's ensure all our countries have in place Election Finances Act. And with these laws, we can be able to regulate expenses that are supposed to be used during elections. With these laws, we can be able to regulate reporting and disclosure of sources of funds that are going to be used during elections. And with these laws, we can be able to allocate a certain percent of public resources to be used by all the politicians and the political parties during elections. And the advantage of having a certain portion or certain allocation of resources from the public monies or from the public resources to be given to politicians, this one will reduce the use of private money. For example, countries like UK, they are very good in regulating private funds, private resources during elections. Even South Africa, regulating private fund or money from individual and donation. We have to regulate. There should be super regulation of donations and the use of private money, especially foreign money, during elections. And this can only be done if we have a very serious regime, a legal regime that regulates election expenses. And then secondly, now you come and merge these two regimes. Now, on the other hand, you have a legal regime that regulates expenses during elections. On the other hand, you have money laundering laws. These laws should communicate each other. For instance, if you have a money laundering act in Tanzania, we need to come up with a regulation and a money laundering act that regulates election related money, so as to avoid use of election time or an advantage of election time to bring in dirty money, and sometimes, of course, to avoid using this dirty money, of course, to make people get into power and later on perpetuate the same behavior. Then those are the two recommendations I'm giving. Then second, the second recommendation, we should create now a strong framework. And this is non-state actors and state actors who will be able to monitor and follow all the practices during elections and report back to state officials, to state apparatus on how political parties, of course, politicians are behaving towards elections. There's no a clear framework from the government, of course, side and from the civil society in our countries that monitor how politicians, both those in power, I mean, those in the incumbents, for example, in Tanzania, we have the ruling party system. In the other countries, you have Uganda and the other countries. When we are talking about the use of money, the use of dirty money, it's not only about money from other, from the opposition parties or whatever. It's from mostly, of course, you look at most likely those who are in power are in a better chances of getting money from all these companies, as I said, multinational companies, even companies within the country that have an element of dirty money and then being used because there's a high level of protection. It is not easy, for instance, for a certain small political party to get dirty money without being identified or being cornered by the state apparatus. What is very easy and likely for a ruling party, for instance, a certain strong party to get all these sources of money, whether being dirty or not, without being properly scrutinized, even by existing legal frameworks. There now comes the use of non-state actors like civil societies, media, and other groups to be able to monitor and report any development or any sign of use of dirty money during elections.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so
Yes.
much. Thank you so much on that one. Let me come to Zambia. Chimuka, you've had the recommendations on what can be done, but now my question is a bit, and please keep your responses a bit short for others to be able to also chip in. My question to you is more about how, because in countries where you have dominant political parties, especially dominant ruling political parties, how then do you make such laws work or effective to address the challenges that come with money laundering to influence electoral outcomes?
Okay. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, of course, I will start by maybe indicating some of the measures that are internationally recognized. For example, we have what the UN Convention Against Corruption, Article 7, Part 3, which states that each state, which is a member, of course, needs to consider taking appropriate legislative and administrative measures consistent with the objectives of this UN convention. So what this requires is that our own political parties bill should actually be aligned to the requirements of this particular UN convention, of course, which brings in the fundamental principles of enhancing transparency in the funding of different political party candidates that are actually elected to the different offices. So we definitely need to set up these laws in our different countries. I think learning from Kenya, I think for them they are advanced as far as these laws are concerned. Then we can also tap on what the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption talks about as far as funding of political parties are concerned, where in our legislation that we come up with, we need to prescribe the use of these funds, how they are acquired and how they are acquired, that's the source, how they are used, and also institutions that are supposed to audit them. There, in addition to that, there's also need to incorporate the principles of transparency into funding of these different political parties that do exist in our different countries. Further to that, for these laws to work, I think we need to put stringent measures, especially when it comes to contribution limits. We don't need to leave it open for different well-wishers or different people that we interact with in order to contribute. So there must be some contribution limits that we are supposed to get. For example, corporations need to give us this amount of money. Organizations need to give us this amount of money. Then spending limits, of course, we need to have a lower and an upper limit in terms of the amount of money that each political party is supposed to spend. Because if we leave it open, this is we'll find that those small political parties that are unable to attract a lot of funding will definitely be unable to participate in the democratic dispensation. So it's very much important to put spending limits to these resources. I think also it's important to put campaign term limits so that we shorten the period of time. The shorter the period of time, the less the money is needed to do campaigns. But if the period of campaigning is too long, you find that people will really go an extra mile to spend even the last coin that they have to try and see how they can woo people to vote for them using these resources that they have. But one of the most important strategies that we need to do is actually bring in the issue of public disclosure, where we allow these political parties to actually disclose where they are getting the finances and also the plan how they are going to use this money. By so doing, we'll have an approach where we are trying to control the flow of money into politics and also be able to curb issues of state capture, because we are able to know where these different political parties are getting the money. I think the aspect of public financing for those governments or countries that have got the muscle to finance political parties, I think is one of the solutions that we can actually put across as far as limiting issues of state capture as it prompts us to receive money from different sources, and some of these sources, of course, are questionable, and so forth and so on. So basically, maybe these are some of the issues that we can put. But in addition to these strategies, we can as well put sanctions for those political parties that do not abide by the regulations of that particular country. Let's say, for example, Campaign Financing Act. I think sanctions can actually be applied to them for non-compliance, so that this can actually set an example to those other political parties that want to go and or would want to operate beyond what the law is prescribing. Enforcement is also very much important. There are countries, of course, that have got these pieces of legislation on political campaign financing, but of course, they are just operating as countries that do not have those legislation. The issue is that there is no enforcement. So if these enforcement agencies that do exist in, or oversight institutions that do exist in different countries could enforce these laws, of course, it will hamper the capacity of these political parties to be able to maneuver and get finances that are questionable from different funders. So to me, I think this can actually go a long way to try and help us deal with the issues of campaign financing, and also have clean money that is involved in politics, and also allow each and every person to be able to participate in a democratic dispensation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Muka. Let me cross to Zambia. Ernest, you've had some of the recommendations and that are being proposed. But let me bring this a bit more home to the context of Africa, because the realities, when you look at most African countries, we have authoritarian regimes. You have incumbents with a lot of power. So how do you think opposition political parties, all probably voices of dissent, can be insulated from using these same laws or proposals to weaponize and further conscript and constrain the work they do in terms of ensuring that you have electoral processes that are transparent, free of influence of dirty money, with credible electoral outcomes. How can we achieve that within the context of our politics?
Okay, thank you very much. I think this one is the difficult one, but let me try. And I also want to thank the previous presenters for their submissions, which I think it's quite possible in terms of the recommendations. So I think we definitely need to tap from the international conventions, like the previous speaker talked about, the International Convention on the United Nations Convention on Anti-Corruption. And also probably right now there is a growing emphasis on the need to comply with the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, the 40 recommendations which are there. And countries have established financial intelligence units, some they call it centers. And I think at the moment, they are not independently monitoring campaign financing. So probably we need to push for independence of these institutions such that they are able to also monitor the campaign financing, pushing for the disclosure of the sources of finances by political parties, and also go further to look at our politicization, which I think from our initial submissions, all the presenters, we did mention the politicization, especially by the ruling parties, of using the institutional resources, using the fiscal resources that is supposed to assist all the citizens or all the political parties in one way or the other. So I do believe if we can have that independence of the institutions created to monitor campaign financing, it may be better. And also our electoral commissions, I think they really need to implement and enforce, for example, the Political Parties Finance Act or the Campaigning Financing Act, and also the Electoral Act for different countries. I believe this is one of the things that we may try to push as countries to ensure that, there is always need for a referee, someone who is not a political player. So sometimes it's very, very difficult for government or for the three organs of the government, looking at the executive, the judiciary, and also the legislature, to really enforce some of these regulatory frameworks. There is need for an independent institution to be the referee and try to play the oversight role. And in this instance, we may mainly depend on the electoral commissions and also the financial intelligence units and centers, especially around issues of money laundering. But also, just to reinforce and buttress what the previous presenter talked about around issues of ensuring that there is electoral integrity, I think it's really important to try and influence the political parties to pledge and to commit to ensure that there is electoral integrity in terms of the finances, in terms of the voting processes itself. I really think it's one of the areas which also then justify the need to create an enabling environment for civic and non-state actors to play their role of playing the watchdog role, so that, in the conduct of electoral processes, there is non-state actors who are coming into play to assist in terms of the oversight, to also search for illegitimate behavior, and at the same time try and raise the public awareness about the importance of oversight over the political or the campaign financing. So these are some of the things that I think in our situation, it may help, though it's tricky. Obviously, we also need to try and mobilize for pressure groups, be it regional, be it continental and international, such that, we really deal with the issues of campaign financing, especially countering money laundering. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ernest. You've talked about the oversight role, and this is where I throw in Yona, Because I know civil society, where you belong, you've been at the forefront of trying to push for some of these reforms in this area. But do we have cases of best practices for civil society to support anti-money laundering within campaign financing? If not, what are some of the best practices that you'd recommend as a take-home?
Thank you, Felix. This is quite a challenging topic because we are dealing and talking about organized crimes. Organized crimes where the perpetrators seem to be the ones in charge. While already our colleagues have already mentioned the legal framework on anti-money laundering from the international, regional, and almost national, we are still faced by several problems still within the region. When we talk about dirty money, already there are international systems developed that banks do the de-risking. Money in, money out can be seen globally, and they share information with the institutions that we are talking about to be strengthened. The challenge with the countries within sub-Saharan Africa, they are cash-based economies. These politicians move with monies in their boots because it becomes very hard to regulate what you are not seeing. If the monies were being channeled through mobile monies, if the money were being channeled through banks, then the laws would work. But we are talking about someone loading money in a helicopter and moves around from one province to another. How are you to track that? It becomes a bit challenging. So maybe, again, in some of the policy reforms, there is need to highly recommend in political or campaign financing a cashless-based economy. Colleagues have spoken about the capacity. Yes, there is need, again, to improve the capacity of the law enforcement agencies to be able to increase their skills in tracking monies that are untrackable. There is what they call follow the money. And now we are moving away from the cash-based money also to cryptocurrency, which most of the regulators within the region have limited capacity to track. Maybe that's another area that perhaps we also need to focus. There is need, again, as a sector, to support or to advocate for us, for our countries, different countries, to uphold the right to information in government spending. We do not know how much does the government spend? Who orders the printing of money? In my own country, there is when money, we're having 2 notes of 50,000 notes, 2 notes of 20,000 notes without an explanation. I remember one time asked the bank governor, why do we have the same currencies with the same value? And actually, to him, it wasn't a problem, but it really shows you that money is being printed for certain purposes whenever there is a deficit. So we need a very strong fiscal monitoring policy. Our colleagues have also highlighted several aspects in the reform, but what I'm also emphasizing that while the laws and regulations are there, we need to conscientize the population. We need to make them aware of how money interferes with the future of a nation. Because in autocratic governments, in governments with democracy deficits, it's only social movement and the people who can deliver the accountability. We also need, again, to empower platforms of accountability that can hold these law enforcers accountable. Yes, there were some cases in Uganda where candidates were involved in corruption tendencies, bribing, and all that. But again, like our colleague in Kenya said, that since their godfathers who are in politics, they always advocate and manipulate processes for you, for the judgment to come in your favor. So it's only people, again, who can liberate themselves. As a sector, what we need to do is, one, to make people aware and to get them the information for them to act on their behalf. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jonah. Quite interesting, because now, Sheila, I know at some point you wanted to give your take on the recommendations, but I have a specific question which you have to tie in as you respond, because it's very clear that laws are not enough, but even where you have laws, there are still challenges of enforcement. And the question here when it comes to Kenya, because Kenya is a very interesting case, whether is it possible to for laws, can really laws work in an environmental system that is owned by I don't know whether should I call them cartels, powerful people. I think you know the concept called state capture, that even when you have laws, those laws they are organized. The interests around those laws are organized to serve interests of a few powerful who have access, including those who engage in money laundering. So there have been recommendations around the legal frameworks, but realistically, can laws address this challenge? If in actual sense, those who should ideally enforce these laws are already under some form of capture by individuals engaging in money laundering?
Felix, I think you've answered your own question. But that is really the challenge of Kenya, because we have a plethora of laws trying to deal with this problem of corruption. And as much as, yes, there are some gaps which, this needs to be legislated, and we have identified areas where we still need that legislation. But the truth is we've spent quite a bit, almost the last 20 years, just developing laws on anti-corruption, from Public Officer Ethics Acts, which require wealth, declaration, which really is not that efficient, even if people are, declaring their income and liabilities and so on. You still find there's an inadequacy in terms of implementation. We have laws on leadership and integrity, which require that anyone seeking office should be someone of, integrity, someone who is, who can win public trust, who is honest, and so on. But then we still have people who have been accused of corruption, who have even been arraigned in courts and charged, some even removed from office through very legal processes like being impeached, and some who have been convicted, but who are still allowed to continue to vie for office. But yet we have a leadership and integrity law, which spells out the quality of leadership and people who should serve in office, which really tells you that then we have a problem in terms of implementation. Because again, the people who are responsible or who would oversight that implementation are political actors themselves. And that's why I've said for campaign financing, it hasn't really seen the light of day, because every time we have regulations which need to be considered in Parliament, parliamentarians will defer the implementation until the next election, meaning that you want to give yourself a free pass to the next election, and then maybe they can be considered in the next election if you're not there. But then they're still there in the next election, so they'll simply continue deferring. So I think it's not just about the laws. We now have to look at what I would call, say, extra legislative means to be able to push some of these issues, particularly in terms of money laundering, because for us, it's a critical issue, looking at where this money is coming from. It's coming from, arms trade, wildlife crimes, human trafficking. That's the reality. Acts of terrorism, terrorism financing as well. That is where this money is coming from. And we need to ensure that it's not coming into elections, because if it is dirty money, it's going to influence the outcome. And for us as a country, we keep on saying that we want cleaner leadership, but will you have clean leadership if whatever resources they're using to support or run their campaigns is not clean? You will continue having the same kind of leaders. So I would say we are looking, even for us as TI Kenya, we're not just looking at implementation through the law. One of the things that we've had to do, which is still legal in a sense, but outside Parliament, is we have been compelled to go to court. We are currently in court. We're waiting for a decision sometime in April. where we actually challenged the decision by Parliament to throw out the regulations, because we decided that we can't keep on canvassing and lobbying members of Parliament. They'll tell you one thing, but when it comes to the floor of the House, they'll do something else in regard to campaign financing. So as some group of civil society actors, we were actually compelled to move to court. So we're in court. We're waiting to see the outcome of that case and to see whether the court hears and admits our prayers that then compels Parliament to consider the regulations that it threw out, so that there's actually implementation of this law. So that's one way. Another way that we've also been looking at is to see how we decampaign the use of big money in politics. And so we are currently involved in a lot of civic education and vetting exercises on the ground, social vetting exercises, where we're encouraging citizens to actually vet and ensure that people who are seeking office actually meet the aspirations and the standards set out in our constitution on leadership. And one of the things, of course, that they're using clean money for the elections. So we're asking them, when these people come to you and ask for a vote, can you also ask them what is the source of their money? Because one of the things that we've seen also on the ground is that people have been, in terms of people's acceptability of handouts. It's quite, people are very open about receiving handouts from politicians, and this is what's driving the problem. And in fact, there's a common thing that people say: you accept the bribe that a politician is giving you. But it doesn't mean that you have to vote for them. Just take the money, but you don't have to vote for them. But what we're saying, actually don't take the money at all. Because if you take that money, it has an implication on service delivery, on your resources after they get into office, because they'll have to recover it from somewhere. And so what we're saying is, when someone comes with all that money on the ground, you have to ask them, where are you getting this money? Can you tell us where this money is coming from? We're also encouraging politicians to actually do self-declarations. That yes, this is in limbo because Parliament has not passed those regulations. But as a responsible politician who adheres or leads to the principles of leadership and governance set and our national values, can you just be proactive and just self-declare? Give us that declaration of where you're getting your money from, how much it is, who your sources are, and how you're spending it. Because in that way, you're starting to show transparency. And if you show transparency at that level, when you are before you get into office, it's also an indication that you could be that transparent leader that we need, who is very honest in terms and accountable for public resources. So those are some of the strategies we are trying to use. And just pushing it also to in terms of civic engagement, so that we are able to ensure that we reduce the amount of dirty money that is circulating, especially at this time during the campaign period. But maybe, as I mentioned earlier, for us, one of the things now, if I look at legislative issues, we're looking at also trying to see how we strengthen the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties to enforce compliance on political party accounts, especially in terms of disclosing political parties disclosing their sources of funds. We also want to see better legislation on public fundraisers, because, as I said, a lot of our politicians are also raising money from the public. I think if you talk to any Kenyan right now, most people, especially people who are working, will tell you that they have been approached by one friend or another who's vying in the election to support their campaigns. But we need to ensure that laws are strengthened in regard to public fundraisers and how they're used as a source of money, and to ensure that these sources are traceable. We also want to see the provisions for audit for political party accounts also strengthened, so that parties are required to use audit firms which are in good standing, so that ensure that their accounts are audited and also shared with the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties, and all the monies, even money that they are raising, not money that's just been given by the Exchequer. And then I think one key thing we're also looking at is to see, because as I mentioned, political parties are not designated as non-finance and non-financial businesses or professions. Under our anti-money laundering law, we are pushing for them to be listed as that. so that they are compelled to also report on any suspicious transactions, report on their sources of money, and so on. Though this will be a very long shot, because we try to get lawyers as listed as professions that have to report suspicious transactions. It took several years, even following the enactment of our money laundering law. Because they kept on fighting that, and a lot of our members of parliament also are lawyers. So they just kept on fighting and removing lawyers as one of the professions that have to report suspicious transactions. But finally, last year, our law was amended, our Money Laundering Act was amended to add lawyers as that. But then they are in court. They are in court seeking to be removed as professionals that have to report suspicious transactions. So I would imagine that also having political parties listed would also be a hard sell. As I said, anything involving politicians, for them, they will always think about themselves. So it's always harder to get that passed. But those are some of the strategies we're looking at moving forward.
Course, being a politician comes with the territory of being selfish. We have about 13 minutes to the top of the hour to end this discussion. I'm opening it up for any questions, comments, clarifications to our online participants. Feel free to throw in your questions. I will be very happy to answer them or respond to them. But as we wait for the panelists to answer those questions that are coming through, if any, I can probably, as we conclude to the tail end, throw in one question to each one of you, given your perspectives and take. We've discussed so much about the laws, the legal framework, and I think let's flip it a bit and bring it closer home, because I must appreciate that between you and me, this still seems to be more of an allied conversation. And for me, sitting down here, I'm asking myself, how do I then bring in a common person? How do I deconstruct the complexity around money laundering and how it affects my political decisions and how it affects service delivery, for example? And let me start with Yona and I move backwards. Yona, how do we deconstruct the complexity around money laundering and bring in a common person to really, really see what you see and do something about it?
Yes, thank you, Felix. It's a very interesting question. Why interesting is that money laundering and other predicate offenses have been made or turned into a normative. Society seems to be accepting the practice, because surprisingly, that money moves through hands, and he who receives also becomes an accomplice. And the challenging bit is that we are talking about a society that is also impoverished. It makes them more vulnerable. They're at the receiving end, so they would rather let it continue, because when the politicians will tell you that when they go to campaign, before they conclude any rally, the voters ask them, what are you leaving? So you feel that it's part of the cultures of several society, and it has been left to grow. If you held a position today as Felix, even your tribesmen, your relatives can sit you down and they tell you, it's your time to eat. I remember that I think there is a Kenyan who, it's your time to eat, and the time is now. These things last for a short time. So you feel when you take a position, it's all about survival and get the quick gains and run out. So to me, one of the things that we need to do is to attach the damage caused or created by money laundering to the denial of the basic services. In my country, they tell you people eat roads. Where there is a brokerage, you see one, and one is eaten. People eat health services. Where hospitals are supposed to be constructed, maybe they eat it. And it kind of sounds simple. It's very hard for a week to end without getting corrupt tendencies, corruption cases and newslights. So we need to sensitize the people on the danger this creates. This also has to be integrated in our curriculum. just like you recite the Apostles' Creed, just like you recite anything, we need to begin sensitizing our societies, our children, our new generation from kindergarten on the danger of corruption. There is need to also name and shame, because when people, actually you are ashamed that you are corrupt and everyone reads about it and your children are howled for that, then perhaps it will also create some fear amongst these. One radical one that is likely not to see the sun so soon is to devalue political gains. For example, imagine if at all we had electoral, generally constitutional reforms, and we have it in the law that no member of parliament should earn more than 1,000 USD, because we've seen doctors who save people's lives earning 2.5 million or 3 million. That is literally less than $1,000 US. The kleptomaniacs will leave the houses of politics. Once we cut down the salaries and give the power to the technical team to drive and set up monitoring systems on corruption tendencies, maybe we shall get there. But the people who funnel the money laundering and corruption are purely politicians. So I feel that beyond sensitizing the society, because our society people are poor, and sometimes in most cases when people are poor, you can hardly make what I would call an objective decision.
All right. Thank you so much, Shona. Interesting. I'm giving each one of you a minute or two as we come to a tail end. Comment on that question. I asked, which Jonas just tried to answer. But also, there's a question that is coming through. What mechanisms do you have in place to ensure that complying with anti-money laundering will not impact negatively on the vulnerable members of society? Yeah, I think someone can also attempt to answer that. Let me start with you, Chimuka. Chimuka.
Thank you so much. The first question that you asked, I think it's very much important for us to be able to narrow this hot topic to the common understanding of the citizens. And some of the mechanisms that I have on top of my head, and speaking from what Transparency International Zambia has been doing, is to do capacity building, first of all, to political parties, lower structures, for them to be able to understand the effects of big money in politics, but also involve different civil society organizations that are working around governance in order to be able to spread the news of the effects of big money in politics, but most importantly, use the existing platforms or social movements of youths to also engage and have discussions about the effects of big money in politics, but most importantly, to try and also champion the enactment of a piece of legislation as far as campaign financing is concerned in our country. Secondly, I think the media also should play an important part when it comes to sensitizing citizens so that they are able to know the other side of the coin. It's not only money, but where does this money come from and what effect does it have when it comes to issues of service delivery? Because when you look at the different auditors general reports, when you look at the FIC reports, of course, they do indicate that we are losing a lot of money. And part of this money is actually benefiting the same people that pumped more money during elections. So when we flip the coin and we show the citizens to say that if we are not going to advocate for this or speak for this, we'll definitely be every now and then receive poor service delivery in terms of our social sectors. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let me see. I think Ernest excused himself to leave, so let me come to Onesmo quickly. Onesmo, are you there? Your comment on the question?
Yes, I think my colleagues have elaborated more.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me come to Sheila, and Sheila also. Can you attempt to answer that question which came through? Someone wants to know the mechanisms that are in place. I think issues around compliance. Yes, you have the laws, but the aspect of compliance, how do we ensure compliance? Probably you can also, you partly touch it, but you can, for purposes of Pastor is raising that question, answer that, and also your take on the how do we bring this home to a common person? Sheila?
Okay, thanks. In terms of compliance, perhaps it is about the reporting mechanisms as well, and the institutions that we put in place to ensure compliance, like for instance with money laundering. Like for us in Kenya, we have the Financial Reporting Center, which is supposed to consistently monitor any illicit, suspicious transactions, but and even banks are supposed to do that. And I think probably what I would say for our country, maybe there's been some progress in the last few years because the banks have become quite tough in terms of just monitoring, because we had a big scandal in 2015 involving the National Youth Service, where it came out that banks were quite complicit in it because they let people withdraw huge amounts of money in cash and even some deposit without asking any questions. And of course, they were really fined heavily. And just because of that, now we have banks being very, very vigilant in terms of that. And there are more controls in terms of deposits and withdrawals. And we have the regulators, the oversight institutions, the Financial Reporting Center, Central Bank, also being a bit strict and monitoring the banks. But there's also the reporting aspect. And I think even as civil society, it's one of the things that maybe we need to look at very closely. What are our reporting institutions, what are our oversight institutions doing about this? Are they reporting regularly, accurately? Are these reports out there? Demand some of this information to ensure that there's actually compliance, because you'll have the law, but if those mechanisms are not put in place to ensure compliance, particularly where we know or what we call trouble spots, like in the case of money laundering, we know one area would be, where you'd see a red flag is, for instance, in the banking sector and so on. Even for the people who are supposed to report any illicit financial transactions, are they reporting, the likes of in terms of gambling, casinos, and all these other people who are supposed to report as per the law. So that's to ensure that is done. In terms of bringing this home to citizens, for us, I think especially when it comes to just tying it in, like how we have discussed it today, how it connects politically and how then it comes to affect them. Because for us, when it comes to what we're doing right now as civic education and why we're telling people it is important to actually reject this money, and someone has just talked about it, it happens in Kenya as well. Someone comes into campaign and you leave large amounts of money for citizens. Then thereafter, there's so much violence because everyone is fighting for that money. And then at the end of the day, you'll find that you're even getting less than $50. And we always ask people, what can that $50 buy? A packet of salt, maybe? A loaf of bread that you will clear within 4 minutes, 3 minutes, and it's gone. So why do it? And yet that money we know is actually money that has been gotten illicitly because maybe someone has been involved in kidnapping and has sold, children or women to another country, as human trafficking. People have been involved in wildlife crime. We've had issues of our, we have questions around and even concerns around our some of our wildlife going extinct, like the elephants, and we had the whole issue of ivory being sold and the tusks them being detasked, and you find ivory being sold in other countries and so on. So we try to bring all these issues close home and tie all these things in regard to human rights, environmental conservation, terrorism, and what it means even for their own security, that we could be accepting that money, but it could be money that could have been gotten because someone has been involved in terrorism. So what does it mean? It means that your security is being compromised, or we are, compromising on environmental conservation efforts. So I think there are those things that maybe perhaps we can do to just break it down so people understand why we cannot continue to tolerate dirty money in our politics, because it has an impact in other aspects of their life. And it all comes down back to how then our economies run, and what does that mean in terms of money just circulating, or the cost of living, standards of living, and so on.
Okay, thank you so much. That was Sheila. She's the current executive director of Transparency International, but also with me I had Ernest Mai, who left earlier, but Ernest Mai is the current head of programs for the National Association of Non-Government Organizations. He works in Zimbabwe. Also on the panel we had Yona Wanjala, who is the current executive director of Defenders Protection Initiative, and with me as well I had Onesmo Olengurumwa from Tanzania, who is an advocate of the High Court of Tanzania and the Pan-African Human Rights Defender. Also with me I had Chimuka Nachivinga from Zambia. Chimuka is the current program lead at Transparency International Zambia, and we were discussing money laundering and campaign finance in Eastern and Southern Africa. And time check is 4:01, and let's leave it at this. But we can continue with the conversations on our social media platforms. It was our 4th monthly series on money in politics. Until next time, bye-bye, stay safe. I, Felix Kafuma, I sign out as a moderator. God bless.
Thank you.